Let's talk about how the Tudor Black Bay GMT is actually better than the Rolex GMT Master II. Uh-oh.
Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good, fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts, I pop off when I hear people say I cannot. I get off to the thought of proving everyone wrong, I won't stop to the top, so you better back off and get lost. I'ma stay loud, stay proud, never running out, never heading down.
Alright, I'm willing to concede the Rolex GMT Master II has several advantages over the Tudor Black Bay GMT. The Rolex is the original true GMT wristwatch. Rolex designed their original GMT for Pan Am pilots, so they could use the rotating bezel to keep track of a second time zone while flying their routes. Then around 1983, the Rolex GMT Master II was born. The new movement had a jumping hour hand, so the wearer could keep track of two different time zones, and even a third time zone temporarily by turning the bezel. The GMT Master II is arguably one of the most iconic pilot's watches of all time. As many of you know, the founder of Rolex, Hans Wilsdorf, also founded the Tudor Watch Company to be a cheaper alternative to the Rolex brand. Tudor's Black Bay GMT is clearly paying homage to the bigger brother Rolex. But is it possible that Tudor has surpassed their older and more expensive brother? Let's talk about these two popular watches, and I'll give you 10 ways the Tudor Black Bay GMT is actually the better watch. First, let's talk about the modern Rolex GMT Master II movement. The Rolex GMT Master II has a slimmer and better movement with their in-house caliber 3285. The 3285 has 31 joules, vibrates at 28,800 vibrations per hour, and carries a 70-hour power reserve. Rolex uses a parachrome hairspring, which delivers anti-magnetic properties. This Rolex movement also uses their latest and greatest parallax shock system, offering superior shock resistance. The GMT Master II has a guaranteed accuracy of plus to minus 2 seconds a day, which is pretty good for an automatic movement. The Rolex GMT has a more refined case profile, measuring 40 millimeters wide, having a lug-to-lug distance of about 48 millimeters, a case thickness of around 12 millimeters, and a perfect 22 millimeter lug width. The current GMT Master II bracelet offers a 5 millimeter quick extension. Overall, I have to admit the Rolex GMT fits a little better on my wrist. The bicolor bezel of the Rolex GMT is made of a scratch-resistant ceramic, or what Rolex calls Cerachrome. The Tudor Black Bay GMT was first released in 2018 and immediately was a hit. The Tudor has a true GMT movement. It closely resembled the vintage Rolex GMT with aluminum bezel and can be had at a fraction of the price. The Tudor Black Bay GMT features a case that is overall larger than the Rolex in every dimension, having a 41 millimeter wide case with a 50 millimeter lug-to-lug. It measures about 14.7 millimeters thick when you include the domed sapphire crystal. The Tudor Black Bay GMT also has a larger bracelet measuring 22 millimeters between the lugs. Tudor's in-house GMT movement is called the MT5652. It has 26 joules, also vibrates at 28,800 vibrations per hour, and also has a 70-hour power reserve. The Tudor GMT movement is COSC certified, which means its accuracy standard is within -4 to +6 seconds per day. Instead of the parachrome hairspring, Tudor uses a silicone balance spring, which still offers anti-magnetic properties. Tudor advertises the MT5652 as being an in-house movement. The movement is actually made by Kinesi, which is a movement manufacturer that is owned in large part by Tudor. But the company is shared with other brands like Breitling and Chanel, so I guess it's fair play to claim it's an in-house caliber. So now that we've gone over some of the general specs and some differences between the Rolex GMT Master II and the Tudor Black Bay GMT, I want to highlight 10 differences where the Tudor is actually the better watch. Number 1. A domed sapphire crystal. Tudor uses a domed sapphire crystal as opposed to Rolex with their flat crystals on their modern GMT Master II. Many watch collectors prefer the look of a domed crystal as it offers some dial distortion at angles. I think that for certain tool watches, it makes sense to have a flat crystal. For example, if I was selecting a crystal for a field watch and I was worried about the crystal being scratched or damaged by rocks, I'd prefer a flat crystal. If I was going diving and wanted to easily read the time underwater, I find that flat crystals are more legible than domed crystals. But on a pilot's watch or a traveler's watch, I don't think the domed crystal detracts from the purpose of the watch. I actually think the domed crystal makes sense and offers a more pleasing and interesting overall aesthetic. When it comes to pilot's watches, I would actually prefer a domed crystal. Number 2, no cyclops. The Tudor GMT doesn't have that annoying cyclops that magnifies the date window. Now I get it. A lot of Rolex owners tend to be older guys, and as we age, our eyesight tends to fade. If I didn't have my perfect 2015 vision, I too might want a Cyclops to help me read that tiny date window. But on the other hand, I think the Cyclops on the Rolex throws off the overall dial symmetry. A Cyclops also adds production cost to the crystal, so for my eagle eyes, I prefer no Cyclops on my GMT dials. Number 3, price and availability. The MSRP for the Tudor on steel bracelet is a little over $4,000 US, while the Rolex GMT Pepsi is well over $10,000 recommended retail price. However, Rolex GMTs aren't readily available at authorized dealers, so people regularly pay well over double the retail price to get one. The Tudor can regularly be had at less than 1/5 of the price that those dirty nasty flippers regularly sell a Rolex GMT. I mean, come on. Number 4, the aluminum bezel. An aluminum bezel isn't nearly as shiny as a ceramic bezel. Plus, it slowly fades over time, which gives it character. Because of this, the Tudor flies under the radar when traveling to strange places, and it doesn't draw quite as much attention. If I was picking a watch to wear when traveling or into a high crime area, I would definitely choose something like a Tudor. Also, if you do lose your timepiece, it gets damaged on one of your adventures, or let's say it gets stolen, I would much rather lose a $4,000 watch as opposed to a piece that will cost me more than $20,000 to replace. Number 5, wrist presence. The Tudor has a larger wrist presence since it has larger overall dimensions. Now I understand fit can be subjective to the person wearing the watch, but some people with large wrists feel the Rolex GMT looks too small on them. So for people with larger wrists, like let's say over 7.5 inches, the Tudor might actually look more proportional on you. Number 6, the water resistance rating. Tudor has a higher guaranteed water resistance rating. The Rolex GMT has a 100-meter water resistance rating, while the Tudor has a 200-meter water resistance rating. Now I understand that Rolex does their own extensive tests, and they tend to underquote their real-world water resistance ratings. The Rolex GMT Master II has Rolex's trip-lock crown system, like the Submariner, but still, whether it's for product differentiation or not, the GMT Master II only guarantees a 100-meter water resistance rating. Don't get me wrong, you can totally swim with the GMT Master II. The Tudor Black Bay GMT, on the other hand, has been tested to withstand more than a 200-meter depth pressure rating. So, for what it's worth, Tudor guarantees a higher level of water resistance than the Rolex GMT. Number 7, bracelet options. The Tudor GMT has more bracelet options. Rolex gives you the options of buying the GMT Master II on either a Jubilee or on a 3-link oyster bracelet with polished center links. Tudor gives you the option of getting their GMT on a brushed oyster-style bracelet or on a fabric strap or on a leather strap with Tudor branded deployant. The Tudor GMT also has a ton of aftermarket bracelet and strap options offered by third-party sellers. I usually wear my Tudor GMT on an aftermarket brushed Jubilee bracelet from Uncle Seiko. I previously did an unboxing and review of this bracelet if you're interested. But ultimately, if you want the most options for customizability, I think the Tudor GMT is actually the better option. Number 8, brand prestige, or should I say, the brand Tudor doesn't come with the same negative connotations associated with Rolex. Let's face it, there are plenty of Rolex owners that have given the Rolex brand a somewhat tarnished image over the years. When a lot of people think of a Rolex owner, they might think douchebag, flex culture, or they might just associate it with a wealthy businessman like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. Either way, most people, including your boss, your clients, friends, family, or just your run-of-the-mill aspiring street thief, all know their Rolex watch is expensive. Sometimes people don't want the negative connotations associated with Rolex. So if that's you, Tudor may be the better option. Number 9, the lug hole placement. Now there are a lot of dimensions that go into how a watch wears on the wrist. Most people don't consider how shallower set lugs can change how a watch wears on the wrist. And to be fair, if a person wears the Rolex GMT how Rolex intended it, on the bracelet and only on the bracelet, this design choice wouldn't matter. But I think the Tudor GMT has lugs that are set proportionately lower, and the lugs are spaced at a distance away from the sides of the case itself, making the Tudor wear better on fabric and leather straps. A watch with higher set lugs puts a visible bump where the NATO passes through. And thicker rubber or two-piece leather straps can even rub on the sides of certain cases if the lugs are set closer to the case sides. The underside of the Tudor also lies pretty flat on the wrist, which does make wearing a NATO or fabric strap easier. I personally purchased a Black Bay 58 dive watch on leather strap, and I've enjoyed swapping out the deployment buckle with a ton of different leather straps. So again, if you want to do lots of strap changes and want to wear your watch on a fabric strap like a NATO, the Tudor may be the better alternative for certain strap choices. Number 10, and this is probably my favorite advantage the Tudor Black Bay GMT has over the Rolex GMT, the 48-click bidirectional bezel. A modern Rolex GMT Master II has a 24-click bidirectional bezel to coincide with the 24-hour GMT timescale. What this means is that every time you click the GMT bezel, it's jumping approximately 2.5 minutes, or half the distance between the dial's 12-hour plots. The Tudor GMT has a 48-click bezel, so every time I click the bezel, it only covers about 1.25 minutes. Now, you might not think this is a big selling feature, but let me explain. The two most useful sport watch complications for my lifestyle are the 24-hour time GMT complication and a diver's timing bezel, which I use almost daily to time elapsed minutes. Whether I'm cooking eggs or steak or timing boiling pasta or a workout, I could literally use a timing bezel on a daily basis. Now, one downside about a GMT pilot's watch is that I generally don't have the functionality of a timing bezel. But with the Tudor GMT's 48-click bezel, each click of the GMT bezel only moves the GMT ring 1.25 minutes. Using the GMT bezel as an impromptu timing bezel won't be quite as precise as a normal 60-click diving bezel. But with a 48-click bezel, I am able to line up the triangle of the GMT bezel within 1 minute of the minute hand, no matter where the minute hand is positioned on the dial. This allows me to use the GMT bezel of the Tudor as a makeshift timing bezel. That's a pretty big win in my opinion, as the Tudor GMT basically combines the 24-hour GMT complication with the usefulness of a timing bezel. So those are my top 10 reasons why you might prefer the Tudor Black Bay GMT to the Rolex GMT Master II. I mean, can you think of a better one-and-done travel watch that isn't too expensive, has 200 meters water resistance, has a true GMT movement, a makeshift timing bezel, and has iconic styling? If you have experience with both of these watches and want to share your thoughts, please put them in the comments below. And don't forget, fellas, wear your watches.